in as far as expired food products and poisoning allegations are concerned. You will recall, of course, Health Minister Dr Aaron Motsoaledi saying that they are working around the clock to identify a chemical agent that is suspected to be the cause of harm and death to school children, primarily who have consumed snacks from foreign-owned spaza shops. The National Department of Health has since deployed 80 environmental health practitioners to identify the cause of the chemical agent. Now, Gauteng, Limpopo, and recently the Northwest provinces have reported cases in food poisoning incidents. Motsoaledi says the increasing incidents in black communities have also led to the perception that authorities have turned a blind eye to the crisis, which is far from the truth. Let's now bring in Professor Lucia Analich, a food safety expert. Thank you so much, Prof, for your time this afternoon. So, as we've indicated there, yesterday, the Minister, in fact, of Health, Dr Aaron Motsoaledi, that they are deploying the same method as in the listeriosis investigations to try and track down the source of this particular chemical element that is in question. Just looking at the number of food poisoning allegations and cases, in fact, that in some instances have led to death. Just talk to us about your observations in as far as this matter is concerned.
Yeah, good afternoon. Well, to be honest, if you look at the types of symptoms that the children and others have experienced, and the time period within those symptoms, within which those symptoms appeared, was about 30 minutes. And this clearly indicates a toxin, a chemical toxin of some sort, because a microbiological cause is highly unlikely with those kinds of symptoms, with that kind of rapidity of symptoms. So it indicated right at the beginning to me that it's some chemical of some sort that should never have been associated with those kinds of foods that appeared to be the ones causing these poisonings. And so it makes perfect sense that this is an illegal pesticide, whether it's an organophosphate or another type which is commonly illegally found in South Africa, is aldehyde, because it's banned in this country. We are not allowed to use it in South Africa. So the fact that it's available means that it's coming into the country illegally and should not be used under any conditions, and definitely not handled around food or food premises. It is completely unacceptable to do that.
Prof, what is concerning, of course, is that this is not happening in one province. It's happening in several provinces. And I mean, in one case, recently in the Northern Cape, a 4-year-old little girl died and her uncle is fighting for his life. In Kimberley, they fell ill minutes, apparently, after consuming bread bought from a spaza shop nearby. So what are the likelihoods then that, the investigators that have been deployed to various points of reference are looking for the same chemical in the different provinces?
It is highly likely, if there is a very good supply chain coming into South Africa. And very often these illegal supply chains are actually quite well organized, unfortunately. And so if there is this kind of supply chain in place, that is where it has to be broken. So we really have to go to the head of the snake as such and chop that off, so that we can stop the supply into the country in general, if it's being distributed to all the provinces.
And then, of course, Prof, you mentioned there the differences between what we are currently seeing now in terms of this potential chemical and what it is not. So primarily, you'll hear a lot of people saying, I've just come from a restaurant, I'm not feeling well, I have some form of gastro or food poisoning. So that's obviously not what's happening here. So explain the differences for us, please.
Yes, absolutely. This is not what's happening here. Normally, food poisoning from a microbial contamination takes a lot longer to show symptoms. Of course, in children, it is probably going to be a lot quicker than in adults. But when you're looking at a 30-minute window from ingesting that food and already showing symptoms of paralysis and your nervous system shutting down to that extent, as we've seen here, this indicates a toxic chemical of some sort. So when you go to a restaurant, as you've used as an example, and you feel ill afterwards, the next day you might start feeling nauseous, you might have a bit of vomiting or diarrhea, and some people take even 2 to 3 days for a salmonella food poisoning, for example. There are, of course, certain exceptions, and listeria or Listeria monocytogenes, which causes listeriosis, that's an exception to the rule because it can take up to 90 days before you actually show symptoms of listeriosis. But that's an exception to the rule.
Without this chemical source, remaining unknown or not being known at the moment, I mean, what are the likelihoods that we are going to see more of these cases? I mean, we do know, of course, that the Department of Health is doing everything that it can to locate where this chemical is emanating from, with those 80 environmental health practitioners being deployed. I mean, what is the likelihood then that they will, find the source and find it quick?
I'm not so sure that it's going to be that quick, because if it's a well-established ring, then of course there's going to be investigation over time. But it's not only about the environmental health practitioners. The police force has to get involved, because these people are killing our people. So whoever they are. And so there have to be arrests made. There have to be investigations conducted. And the police force is the right one to do that. And so there has to also be very, very close collaboration and coordination between the Department of Health and the Department of Police Services, so that they can work together to try and get to the bottom of this as soon as possible. Because the longer we wait, the more people are going to get ill and possibly die.
And the frustration, of course, Prof, is that a lot of these stores are still open, whether they're owned by foreign nationals or South Africans. So what's the best thing to do here, particularly for people that continue to buy?
They have to be shut down. These stores cannot be allowed to continue to operate under those conditions, because for every day that they are still open and they have contaminated food with these toxic chemicals that might be lying around, then there's a potential risk, of course, that people are still going to get ill and even worse, die. So those shops that are showing these kinds of problems, and there have to be inspections. There have to be inspections conducted, and they should be shut down. I just want to make a clear point here around expiry dates, because I know there's been a lot of talk around best before dates and expired these foods. The issue here is if the product is contaminated because it's been unpacked and repacked, or unpacked and sold as individual sweets or biscuits or a few snacks at a time, then this is not about best before dates at all. This is about a poisoning right from the start because of the exposure of those products to the environment, which contains these toxic chemicals. So the best before date or the expired food is a completely different discussion, because best before does not mean that the food is no longer suitable for human consumption. The use by date is the one to look out for. The best before date is about quality. It's not about safety. And I think that's a common mistake that people make, including sometimes the authorities.
And I think that's an important point, Prof, because a lot of the times we find that, we are told that in some of these stores, the expiry date, they'll say the product expired several weeks ago, et cetera, and therefore that is why it caused some illness. What do you then do when you buy a product that is close to expiry date? What then should you follow in as far as, storing it in your own home so that you also prevent being sick?
If it's got a use by date, and this is usually attributable to perishable foods like your fresh meats, your fish, your pork, your poultry, those kind of fresh cheeses even sometimes have a use by date. And those are the ones that you want to use within that time period. If you see that you might not be using it within that time period and it can be frozen, then I would suggest to freeze it. But then the but comes in here. The but is if you then thaw it, you must use it very, very quickly. You cannot let it stand in the refrigerator for a day or two. So you thaw it, you use it, and get done. Best before date is completely different, and there's no specific rule. Because if I had to eat a chocolate that had gone past its best before date and it contained nuts, and the nuts would go slightly rancid because they get a little old, it's certainly not going to cause food poisoning. So is it a risk to eat it? Probably not. But I don't advocate that we all go out there and start eating foods that are past their best before dates. But, we must just be very careful that we don't suddenly remove all these products from the shelves just because we believe they are unsafe for human consumption, because that's not the case.
So in a nutshell, Prof, what you're saying is basically, whilst we look at best before dates and, sell-by dates, we should also be very cautious in terms of buying from shops that may contain an obvious trace of this chemical that is poisonous, because whether it is best before or sell-by, it is still very much dangerous to consume.
Totally, because if the toxin is there right from the start, the use by, best before, sell by date is completely irrelevant. It becomes completely irrelevant. So it's about the source of the poisoning, and it's about how these pesticides got into the food where they just simply do not belong. And that's why when we develop best before dates, use by dates, it's about a properly produced, manufactured product under the correct conditions. And then we do tests to see how long does it take before that pasteurized milk, for example, becomes spoiled. And that's how we determine the best before dates, use by dates, etc. But we never determine those dates based on an illegal chemical that should never have been in the food in the first place.
An important conversation there, Prof. Thank you so much for your time and breaking it down for us, Professor Lucia Analerche. She's a food safety expert.